Their cat brought home a human tooth. DNA results linked it to a missing person who disappeared 200 miles away. Ellie Harper lived alone in a cozy, weathered cottage on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York. At 62, she had long since embraced solitude as her companion, finding solace in gardening, crossword puzzles, and caring for Mr. Whiskers, a mischievous orange tabby with a knack for dragging home peculiar treasures. The cottage itself was charmingly cluttered, filled with knickknacks collected over decades. Porcelain figurines, faded photographs, and an assortment of oddities that Mr. Whiskers had gifted her over the years. Among these trinkets sat his prize collection, a display case perched atop the mantelpiece, where Ellie proudly showcased his most impressive finds. Bottle caps, feathers, shiny pebbles, and once even a rusted pocket watch. But this morning felt different. As sunlight streamed through lace curtains, Ellie bent to clean up the latest mess left by her feline accomplice, a scattering of dirt and leaves near the front door. She sighed, smiling faintly at his antics, before noticing something glinting among the debris. Her heart skipped a beat when she picked it up. It wasn't one of Mr. Whiskers' usual offerings. It was smaller, whiter, and unmistakably human. A tooth. Ellie's hands trembled as she turned the object over in her fingers. It was slightly yellowed but otherwise intact, its smooth surface cold against her skin. She stared at it, trying to rationalize how such a thing could end up here, in her quiet little world. "Mr. Whiskers," she called softly, glancing toward the cat lounging on the windowsill. He blinked lazily, unbothered by her concern. She placed the tooth on the kitchen counter and began tidying up, though her mind raced with questions. Where had he found it? And more importantly, whose was it? Willow Creek wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis. Everyone knew each other, and crime rarely made headlines beyond misplaced mail or stolen garden gnomes. Yet something about this discovery unsettled her deeply. There was an eeriness to holding a piece of someone else's body, especially when it seemed so out of place. Determined to shake off her unease, Ellie decided to investigate further. She wrapped the tooth in tissue paper and tucked it into a drawer, vowing to ask around town later. Surely someone would know if anyone local had recently lost a tooth, or worse. Later that afternoon, Ellie ventured into Willow Creek's quaint downtown area, stopping by the bakery for a loaf of sourdough, and then heading to the library where her friend Margaret worked. Margaret, a spry woman in her late 60s, with silver hair, always tied back in a neat bun, greeted Ellie warmly from behind the circulation desk. "Morning, Ellie. What brings you in today?" Margaret asked, adjusting her glasses. "I need your help with something strange," Ellie replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. She pulled the tooth from her bag and set it on the counter between them. Margaret's eyes widened. "Good heavens, what is that?" Well, I think it's a human tooth. Mr. Whiskers brought it home this morning." "A tooth?" Margaret leaned closer, inspecting it. "That's certainly not ordinary. Have you asked Dr. Peterson? He might recognize it if it belongs to one of his patients." Ellie nodded thoughtfully. "I'll stop by after this, but," she hesitated, her voice dropping even lower. "Something feels off. This doesn't seem like it belongs to anyone from around here." Margaret frowned. "What makes you say that?" "I don't know," Ellie admitted. "Just a feeling. Like it came from somewhere far away, or maybe someone who hasn't been seen in a while." Margaret's expression darkened. "You're not suggesting—" No, Ellie said quickly. "I'm just saying it's unsettling. I'll figure it out." As they parted ways, Ellie couldn't shake the nagging sensation that this tooth was more than just a bizarre curiosity. It carried secrets that might lead her down paths she wasn't sure she wanted to explore. On her way to Dr. Peterson's office, Ellie stopped briefly at the park, where children laughed and played under the watchful eyes of their parents. She watched them absently, her thoughts swirling. Could the tooth belong to a child, or perhaps someone older, someone whose absence hadn't yet been noticed? Dr. Peterson confirmed her fears. The tooth didn't match any records of recent extractions or accidents in Willow Creek. His words echoed in her mind as she walked home. the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. By the time she reached her cottage, Ellie realized two things. First, the tooth didn't belong to anyone local. It was foreign, unfamiliar. Second, Mr. Whiskers hadn't brought it from nearby woods or fields. Something, or someone, had come to Willow Creek. And whatever it was hiding in plain sight. As night fell and the wind rustled through the trees outside, Ellie locked her doors and drew the curtains tight. For the first time in years, she felt truly uneasy in her own home. Somewhere out there, answers waited, but uncovering them might change everything she thought she knew about her peaceful little town. And deep inside, she wondered, should she keep digging or let sleeping dogs lie? The next morning, Ellie decided it was time to involve someone with authority. Though she prided herself on her independence, the tooth and the eerie events surrounding its discovery had shaken her composure. She picked up the phone and dialed Sheriff Tom Grayson, a childhood friend who had served Willow Creek faithfully for over 3 decades. "Tom, it's Ellie," she said when he answered, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I need your advice about something unusual." Tom chuckled warmly, his gravelly voice carrying hints of their shared history. "Unusual? Coming from you, that could mean anything. What's going on?" After a brief hesitation, Ellie explained the situation. The tooth, Dr. Peterson's confirmation that it didn't belong to anyone local, and her growing unease. To her relief, Tom listened without interrupting, though she could hear the skepticism in his tone when he finally spoke. "A human tooth, huh? And you're sure Mr. Whiskers didn't just swipe it off some kid's Halloween costume or knock it out of somebody's mouth during one of his adventures?" he teased lightly. Ellie sighed. "Tom, I'm serious. Something feels wrong about this. Can you at least send it off for testing? Maybe they can identify who it belongs to or where it came from." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Tom relented. "All right, Ellie, I'll take care of it, but don't go getting yourself worked up over nothing. You know how cats are. They find all sorts of weird things." Despite his dismissive tone, Ellie knew Tom would follow through. He might act gruff, but he always took her concerns seriously, even if only because of their lifelong friendship. Over the next few days, as she waited for news from the sheriff's department, Ellie began noticing unsettling changes around her property. At first, they were subtle enough to dismiss as coincidences. A few scuffed marks near the garden shed, as though someone had leaned against it, or faint impressions in the damp earth along the dirt road leading to her house. But then came the noises. At night, lying awake in bed, Ellie heard sounds that made her skin crawl. The creak of branches swaying in the wind was familiar, comforting even. But these were different. Soft crunches in the gravel driveway, like hesitant footsteps. The distant hum of an engine cutting out abruptly, followed by silence. Once she swore she heard a low murmur of voices outside her window, though when she crept downstairs to investigate, there was no one there. Each incident left her more rattled than the last. By day, she tried to rationalize them. Teenagers daring each other to sneak onto her property, hunters passing through the woods, or simply her imagination running wild. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. One afternoon, while inspecting the garden shed, she spotted something that sent a chill down her spine. Fresh footprints pressed her into the soft soil behind the structure. They weren't large, but they were unmistakably human, the tread patterns suggesting boots rather than sneakers. Whoever had left them hadn't bothered to cover their tracks. Her heart pounded as she scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone lurking among the pines. But the woods remained still, their shadows stretching long in the autumn sunlight. When Tom called later that week to update her on the forensic analysis, Ellie hoped for answers. But what she got instead was frustratingly vague. "They're still working on it," Tom said, his tone clipped. "These things take time, Ellie. Don't go jumping to conclusions until we know more." "But what about the footprints?" she pressed, recounting the details of her recent discoveries. "And the tire tracks? Someone's been coming onto my property, Tom. Doesn't that bother you?" There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Look, I'll send a deputy out to check things over, okay? But unless you've got solid evidence of foul play, there's not much I can do. People wander onto private land all the time. It's probably nothing. His words stung, not because he doubted her, but because she sensed his reluctance to dig deeper. Nearing retirement, Tom preferred to avoid complications, especially ones that might disrupt the peace of his final months in office. Still, Ellie appreciated his promise to send help. That evening, Deputy Carla Myers arrived, clipboard in hand, to survey the area. Young and eager, Carla seemed genuinely interested in Ellie's concerns, jotting down notes as she examined the footprints and tire tracks. "I'll file a report," Carla assured her before leaving. "If anything else happens, call us right away." Though grateful for the gesture, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the authorities were treating her fears as trivial. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped her cottage once again, she realized she might have to take matters into her own hands. That night, unable to sleep, Ellie sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the shadowy landscape. The moon hung low, casting pale light across her yard. Everything appeared quiet, serene, but appearances could be deceiving. As she sipped her tea, her gaze drifted to Mr. Whiskers, curled up asleep on the armchair beside her. His occasional twitch reminded her of how he'd brought the tooth home in the first place. Was it mere coincidence, or had he stumbled upon something sinister? Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. Ellie's peaceful life in Willow Creek was about to change, and whether she liked it or not, she was already knee-deep in a mystery that refused to let her go. It was a crisp autumn morning when Sheriff Tom Grayson pulled into Ellie's driveway, his expression unusually grave. She had been expecting an update, but hadn't anticipated the look of unease etched across his face as he stepped out of his patrol car. Without waiting for him to knock, Ellie opened the door and ushered him inside. "Tom, what is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. He hesitated, removing his hat and clutching it tightly in his hands. "The lab results came back," he said finally, meeting her gaze. "And, well, you're not going to believe this." Ellie's stomach tightened. "Just tell me." "The tooth. It belongs to Sarah Langley." For a moment there was silence. Then Ellie's eyes widened in shock. "Sarah Langley? As in, the Sarah Langley who disappeared 20 years ago?" Tom nodded somberly. "The very same. Her case made headlines statewide. Everyone thought she ran away or got caught up in something bad in the city. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head, "now we've got part of her turning up here, over 200 miles from where she vanished." Ellie sank onto the couch, her mind reeling. She remembered the case vividly. How could anyone forget? Sarah Langley had been just 19 when she went missing from Milwaukee. A bright, ambitious college student with dreams of becoming a journalist, her disappearance had baffled investigators and haunted her family for decades. Despite extensive searches and countless theories, no trace of her had ever been found, until now. "But how?" Ellie whispered, more to herself than to Tom. "How does someone vanish without a trace in one place, only for their remains to show up here, years later?" "That's what we need to figure out," Tom replied, his tone heavy with resignation. "This changes everything. If Sarah Langley's remains are here, then whoever brought them, or whatever happened to her, is connected to Willow Creek, and that means we're dealing with something far bigger than either of us imagined." As the weight of the revelation settled over them, Ellie and Tom began piecing together what little they knew. The footprints near the garden shed, the tire tracks on the dirt road, the strange noises at night, all of it took on new significance. Whoever had left those signs might have been involved in bringing Sarah's remains to this remote corner of upstate New York. "What about Mr. Whiskers?" Ellie asked suddenly, glancing toward the cat lounging by the fireplace. "Could he have found the tooth closer to wherever else they buried her?" Tom frowned, considering the possibility. "It's possible. Cats are curious creatures. They could stumble upon things humans miss. But if that's true, then the rest of her remains must be nearby. We'll need to search the area thoroughly." Ellie nodded, though the thought sent a shiver down her spine. Searching for human remains felt like stepping into territory she wasn't prepared for, a grim reminder that her quiet life had collided with something dark and unresolved. Later that day, Tom organized a team to comb the woods surrounding Ellie's property. Armed with metal detectors and forensic equipment, deputies fanned out across the landscape, their movements methodical yet tense. Meanwhile, Ellie stayed close to home, unable to shake the feeling that she was sitting at the center of a storm. She spent hours poring over old newspaper clippings about Sarah's disappearance, which Tom had brought along for reference. The articles painted a picture of a young woman full of promise, beloved by her family and friends. They also highlighted the frustration and heartbreak of a community left with unanswered questions. One detail stood out to Ellie. Sarah had last been seen leaving a coffee shop late at night after studying for exams. Witnesses reported seeing her get into a car, an older model sedan, but couldn't identify the driver. That single clue had fueled endless speculation, yet no solid leads ever emerged. As she read, Ellie couldn't help but wonder, had Sarah known her abductor, or had she fallen victim to a random act of violence? And why, after all these years, had her remains ended up here in Willow Creek? By evening, the search yielded nothing conclusive, though several spots were flagged for further investigation. Exhausted but determined, Tom returned to Ellie's cottage to give her an update. "We didn't find anything definitive today," he admitted, rubbing his temples, "but we'll keep looking. In the meantime, I want you to stay vigilant. If you see anything unusual, or if you feel unsafe, call me immediately." Ellie nodded, grateful for his concern, yet even as she thanked him, she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of urgency building within her. This wasn't just about solving a cold case. It was about uncovering the truth behind a tragedy that had lingered for 2 decades. And somehow, against all odds, that truth had landed squarely on her doorstep. As Tom drove away and the shadows lengthened outside, Ellie realized she was no longer merely an observer. Whether she liked it or not, she was now part of Sarah Langley's story, and finding answers would mean confronting secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. That night, unable to sleep, Ellie sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of chamomile tea and a growing pile of printed articles spread out before her. The soft glow of the overhead light illuminated faded photographs of Sarah Langley, smiling confidently in her college sweatshirt, posing with friends outside a bustling cafe, or standing proudly beside a stack of textbooks. Each image painted a vivid picture of a young woman full of promise, whose life had been tragically cut short. But it wasn't just Sarah's smile that captivated Ellie. It was what lay beneath the surface. As she sifted through news clippings and online archives, one detail stood out repeatedly. Sarah had been working on an investigative piece about corruption within a powerful real estate development firm called Harmon Heights Group. According to interviews with professors and classmates, she had uncovered evidence suggesting illegal land deals, bribes, and environmental violations tied to several high-profile projects across Wisconsin. "She was onto something big," Ellie murmured aloud, tracing her finger over a headline from a campus newspaper. "Student journalist digs deep into corporate scandal." The article detailed how Sarah had spent months gathering documents, interviewing sources, and piecing together connections between local politicians and Harmon Heights executives. Yet despite her diligence, she had struggled to find concrete proof that could hold up in court, or so her advisor claimed in a follow-up interview after her disappearance. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine as she read between the lines. If Sarah had indeed stumbled upon damning information, it wouldn't be hard to imagine why someone might have wanted her silenced. Powerful corporations didn't take kindly to exposure, especially when billions of dollars were at stake, and if they'd gone to such lengths to cover their tracks 20 years ago, who's to say they wouldn't do the same now? Her thoughts turned to Willow Creek. Why here? What connection did this sleepy little town have to a major corporate scandal centered in Milwaukee? Was it possible that someone involved in Sarah's disappearance had ties to the area? Or had her remains simply been dumped here, far from prying eyes, as part of a desperate attempt to erase all traces of her existence? Whatever the reason, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. This wasn't just about solving a decades-old mystery. It was about giving Sarah justice, ensuring her story didn't fade into obscurity like so many others before hers. By morning, Ellie's resolve had hardened. She knew Sheriff Grayson and his team were doing everything they could, But bureaucracy moved slowly, and resources were limited. If she wanted answers, she would need to dig deeper herself. She began by reaching out to retired journalists who had covered Sarah's case back in the day. One name kept popping up: Margaret Hensley, a veteran reporter for the Milwaukee Tribune who had written extensively about Harmon Heights Group during Sarah's investigation. Though long since retired, Margaret still lived in Milwaukee, according to social media profiles Ellie managed to track down. With trembling hands, Ellie dialed Margaret's number. After a few rings, a cautious voice answered. "Hello? Miss Hensley, my name is Ellie Harper. I'm calling because I think I may have found something related to Sarah Langley's disappearance." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Margaret finally spoke, her tone was sharp but intrigued. "Sarah Langley? That poor girl. What makes you think you found something?" Ellie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's complicated, but I believe Sarah's remains have surfaced in a small town near where I live. I've been reading your work, and I was hoping you might be willing to share some insights into what she was working on before she vanished." Another pause, followed by a sigh. "You're not the first person to call me about Sarah over the years. But most folks lose interest once they realize how dangerous it can get poking around in cases like this." "I understand," Ellie said firmly, "but I owe it to her and to myself to see this through." Margaret chuckled dryly. "All right then, Miss Harper, let's talk." Over the next hour, Margaret shared details that sent chills down Ellie's spine. She confirmed that Sarah had been closing in on Harmon Heights Group, specifically targeting a shadowy figure known only as the broker, a middleman rumored to facilitate illicit transactions for the company. No one had ever identified him publicly, but whispers suggested he was deeply embedded in both corporate and political circles. "What happened to the evidence Sarah gathered?" Ellie asked, scribbling notes furiously. "That's the million-dollar question," Margaret replied. "Some say she destroyed it before disappearing. Others believe it was stolen, or worse, used against her. Either way, nothing ever made it to the authorities." As the conversation wound down, Margaret offered one final warning. "Be careful, Ellie. People don't forget easily, especially when it comes to scandals like this. If you start digging too deep, you might unearth things better left buried." Ellie thanked her and hung up, her heart racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was darker and more complex than she had anticipated. Someone had gone to great lengths to silence Sarah, and they might not hesitate to do the same to anyone else who got too close. Sitting amidst the scattered papers and empty coffee cups, Ellie realized this case had become deeply personal. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about fighting for the truth in a world that often preferred to look away. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, driven by a purpose that transcended her quiet routines and solitary days. Yet even as determination burned within her, fear lingered at the edges of her mind. Whoever had brought Sarah's remains to Willow Creek had chosen this place for a reason. And if Ellie wasn't careful, she might find herself entangled in a web far more dangerous than she could imagine. Still, she couldn't turn back now. Not when Sarah's voice, a voice silenced 2 decades ago, was finally beginning to speak again. Ellie's investigation took a turn when she began piecing together fragments of conversations and rumors that had floated around Willow Creek for years. At first glance, they seemed innocuous, just the kind of small-town chatter people indulged in over coffee or at church socials. But now, armed with what she'd learned about Sarah Langley and Harmon Heights Group, Ellie started seeing patterns where once there had only been noise. It all came back to the land. Decades ago, Willow Creek had been a patchwork of family-owned farms and rolling pastures, untouched by industry. Then, seemingly overnight, developers descended on the area, offering lucrative deals to buy up parcels of pristine farmland. The sales were framed as progress, bringing jobs and economic growth to a sleepy town. But not everyone was convinced. Some whispered that the prices paid were suspiciously high, while others claimed the buyers used intimidation tactics to pressure reluctant sellers into signing contracts. Ellie remembered hearing snippets of these stories during her morning walks through town. Old Mr. Peterson, who ran the general store, often grumbled about city slickers buying up property without caring about the community. And Margaret, her friend from the library, had once mentioned how strange it was that so many deals went through without proper public hearings or transparency. At the time, Ellie hadn't thought much of it. Such things happened everywhere, didn't they? It was easy to dismiss the complaints as nostalgia for simpler days or resistance to change, but now, as she revisited those memories, she couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that something darker lurked beneath the surface. Her breakthrough came one afternoon while sorting through Old Town records at the library. Margaret, ever the helpful ally, had pulled out dusty ledgers and archived meeting minutes dating back to the early 2000s, the same period when Sarah Langley vanished. As Ellie pored over the documents, certain names kept appearing again and again: wealthy developers, local politicians, and even a few prominent families in Willow Creek. One name stood out in particular: Harmon Heights Group. The real estate firm wasn't just involved in developments near Milwaukee. Its reach extended deep into rural areas like Willow Creek. According to the records, several key players in the company had purchased large tracts of farmland here under shell corporations, masking their true identities. These transactions coincided with the time frame of Sarah's disappearance, raising unsettling questions. Why would a major developer target Willow Creek? Ellie muttered aloud, flipping through pages filled with legalese and financial jargon. Unless they needed somewhere remote to hide something. Margaret leaned over her shoulder, frowning. You think this is connected to Sarah? I don't know yet, Ellie admitted, but it's too much of a coincidence. What if someone in town helped them cover their tracks? Maybe even profited from it? Margold nodded grimly. If that's true, you're treading dangerous ground. People here might not take kindly to having skeletons dragged out of the closet. That evening, as Ellie sat by the fireplace with a notebook in hand, fragments of forgotten conversations resurfaced in her mind. She recalled Mrs. Dunlap, an elderly neighbor, mentioning how her cousin had sold his farm for an outrageous sum after weeks of harassment. There were also rumors about midnight meetings at the old mill outside town, attended by men in expensive suits and locals eager to make a quick buck. And then there was the most chilling detail of all: the sudden departure of Frank Callahan, a lifelong resident and vocal critic of the land deals. He had packed up his belongings and left Willow Creek shortly after speaking out against the developers at a town hall meeting. No one had heard from him since. Ellie scribbled down each memory, connecting the dots between Sarah's investigation, the shady transactions, and the whispers of corruption that had haunted Willow Creek for decades. It was starting to look less like harmless gossip and more like a conspiracy, one that might have cost Sarah her life. By the time dawn broke, Ellie knew she couldn't let this go. Whatever secrets lay buried beneath Willow Creek's idyllic facade, they were tied to Sarah's fate, and possibly to the tooth Mr. Whiskers had brought home. Someone in this town had played a role in silencing her, whether knowingly or unwittingly. She felt a mix of fear and determination as she stared out the window at the misty fields stretching beyond her property. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about holding her community accountable for its sins. If Sarah's voice had been silenced 2 decades ago, Ellie would be the one to amplify it now. But as she prepared to dig deeper, she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her, waiting to see how far she'd go before they decided she'd gone too far. As Ellie continued her investigation, her attention turned to those closest to her. Literally. Walter Hensley, her reclusive neighbor whose sprawling property bordered hers, had always been an enigma in Willow Creek. A wiry man in his late 60s with sunken eyes and a perpetually furrowed brow, Walter kept to himself, rarely venturing into town unless absolutely necessary. His family had owned their land for generations, but whispers suggested that much of it had been sold off quietly over the years, to developers. Ellie hadn't thought much of Walter before now. He was eccentric, yes, but harmless, or so she'd assumed. Yet as she pieced together the puzzle of shady land deals and Sarah Langley's disappearance, certain details began to stand out. For one, Walter's property was vast and largely undeveloped, making it an ideal place to hide something, or someone. And lately she'd noticed him lingering near the tree line between their properties more often than usual, watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. Then there were the coincidences. Whenever she spoke to Margaret or Sheriff Grayson about her findings, Walter seemed to appear out of nowhere shortly afterward, asking casual questions about what all the fuss was regarding old land sales. At first, she dismissed his curiosity as idle chatter, but his probing remarks grew increasingly pointed and oddly defensive. One crisp afternoon, as Ellie tended to her garden, she spotted Walter leaning against the weathered wooden fence that separated their properties. He wore his usual faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots, a cigarette dangling from his lips. When he saw her glance up, he gave a curt nod. "Afternoon, Ellie," he called, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "Heard you've been poking around about some old business." Ellie froze mid-motion, her trowel hovering above the soil. How did he know? She forced a smile, trying to mask her unease. "Oh, what do you mean?" Walter shrugged, flicking ash onto the ground. "Just heard folks talking. Something about land deals from years back. Thought maybe you'd stumbled across something interesting." Her pulse quickened. Was this a fishing expedition? Or did he already know more than he let on? Deciding to test the waters, she replied casually, "Well, I've been doing a bit of research, sure. Turns out there's quite a history here. Did your family sell any land during that time?" For a split second, Walter's expression hardened, though he quickly masked it with a thin smile. "Nah, we didn't sell nothing worth mentioning. Just held on to what we had." He paused, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Why? You think there's trouble brewing over old dirt?" "I'm not sure yet," Ellie said carefully. "But I did come across a name while looking into things. Sarah Langley. Ever hear of her?" The change in Walter was subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tightened, and the hand holding the cigarette twitched ever so slightly. "Can't say I have," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Sounds like city nonsense to me." His reaction confirmed Ellie's suspicions. There was something he wasn't saying. Sensing an opportunity, Ellie pressed gently. "It's strange, isn't it, that someone would vanish without a trace and then turn up here, miles away from where they disappeared. Makes you wonder if anyone around here might have crossed paths with her, or knows more than they're letting on." Walter stiffened, his face reddening under his scruffy beard. "Look, Ellie, I don't know nothing about no missing girl, and I don't appreciate being dragged into whatever wild goose chase you're on. My family's lived here longer than most, and we ain't got nothing to hide." His tone carried an edge of irritation, but beneath it lay a nervous energy that betrayed his words. Ellie studied him closely, noting how he shifted his weight from foot to foot and avoided meeting her eyes directly. It was the behavior of someone hiding something, or afraid of being caught. "Well, I didn't mean to upset you," she said softly, backing off to avoid escalating the situation. "I'm just trying to understand what happened. If you remember anything, even something small, I'd appreciate hearing it." Walter exhaled sharply, tossing his cigarette to the ground and grinding it out with his boot. "Like I said, I don't know nothing. Leave me out of it." With that, he turned and strode briskly back toward his house, leaving Ellie standing alone by the fence. As she watched him retreat, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that Walter knew far more than he admitted. Whether he was involved directly or simply protecting someone else, his reaction suggested guilt or fear. The question was, which? She glanced at his property, its dense woods and shadowy corners stretching endlessly beyond the fence. If Sarah's remains had been dumped anywhere nearby, it could easily have happened on Walter's land. The isolation and lack of prying eyes would make it the perfect hiding place. But confronting him further wouldn't help. Not yet. For now, she needed to gather more evidence, to build a clearer picture of what had transpired decades ago. Still, as she returned to her gardening, her mind raced with possibilities. Whatever secrets Walter was guarding, they were tied to the mystery surrounding Sarah, and perhaps to the very heart of Willow Creek itself. And Ellie was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. Ellie's next move was to enlist the help of someone she trusted implicitly, Margaret Maggie Doyle, the sharp-witted librarian who had already proven invaluable in her quest for answers. Over steaming cups of tea at Ellie's kitchen table, she filled Maggie in on her latest discoveries, including Walter Hensley's suspicious behavior and his family's extensive land holdings. Maggie listened intently, her eyes narrowing as Ellie recounted her confrontation with Walter. When Ellie finished, Maggie leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully against the table. "You're on to something," Maggie said finally, her voice low but resolute. "If Walter's family sold land during that time, and if they were dealing with Harmon Heights Group, it could explain why Sarah's remains ended up here. Maybe she found out too much about their involvement." Ellie nodded, feeling a surge of relief at having an ally like Maggie by her side. The retired reporter still had a knack for connecting dots others missed, and her curiosity matched Ellie's own. "What do you think we should do next?" Ellie asked. Maggie smiled faintly. "We dig deeper. If Walter's hiding something, there'll be paper trails or whispers that can lead us to the truth. Let's start with public records and see what we can find." The two women spent the better part of the afternoon combing through old property deeds, tax filings, and corporate documents stored in the library's archives. Maggie's experience as an investigative journalist came in handy. She knew exactly where to look and how to decipher the dense legalese that often obscured important details. Their breakthrough came when they stumbled upon a series of transactions involving Walter's late father, Charles Hensley. According to the records, Charles had sold several parcels of farmland in the early 2000s, not directly to Harmon Heights Group, but to shell companies registered under names that sounded innocuous enough: Pine Ridge Holdings, Oakwood Ventures, and Maple Crest Enterprises. "These are classic dummy corporations," Maggie explained, pointing to the fine print. "They're used to mask the real buyers. But look here." She flipped through another ledger, her finger landing on a footnote buried deep in the document. This one lists Harmon Heights Group as the parent company. Bingo. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. So Walter's family was tied to them after all. And not just tied, they profited handsomely, Maggie added grimly. These sales netted them millions. Enough to make anyone keep quiet if they suspected foul play. As they pieced together the timeline, a chilling narrative began to emerge. Around the same period Sarah Langley disappeared, Charles Hensley had liquidated significant portions of his family's land, selling it off to Harmon Heights Group through intermediaries. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Sarah must have uncovered this connection, Maggie mused, jotting down notes furiously. She was investigating corruption within Harmon Heights, remember? What if she traced some of their dirty deals back to Willow Creek, and specifically to the Hensleys? It would explain why her remains ended up here, Ellie whispered, her mind racing. Maybe someone panicked when they realized she was closing in. They silenced her and dumped her body somewhere remote, hoping no one would ever connect the dots. But it doesn't end there, Maggie continued. If Walter inherited his father's estate and his secrets, he might have gone to great lengths to protect the family name. That could explain why he's so jumpy now. Ellie shivered, recalling Walter's defensive demeanor during their conversation. Had he known about Sarah all along, or had he simply been covering for his father's sins? By evening, the weight of their findings settled heavily over them. They had unearthed evidence linking Walter's family to the very real estate firms Sarah had been investigating, a revelation that painted a disturbing picture of greed, complicity, and possibly murder. "This changes everything," Ellie murmured, staring at the scattered papers on the table. "If Walter knows more than he's letting on, confronting him again could be risky." Maggie nodded solemnly. "We need to tread carefully. People who've kept secrets for decades won't give them up easily. And if Harmon Heights Group is still pulling strings behind the scenes, we could be putting ourselves in real danger." Despite the risks, both women agreed they couldn't stop now. Too many lives, including Sarah's, had been affected by whatever conspiracy had unfolded all those years ago. For Ellie, it wasn't just about solving a cold case anymore. It was about exposing the truth and holding those responsible accountable. As they parted ways for the night, Ellie felt a renewed sense of purpose and fear. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she also knew one thing for certain. The closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. And Walter Hensley was only the beginning. The next morning, as Ellie stepped onto her porch to retrieve the newspaper, she noticed something unusual tucked beneath the welcome mat. A plain white envelope with no return address. Her heart sank as she picked it up and opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. Scrawled in blocky black letters was a message that sent chills down her spine. Stop digging or you'll regret it. Ellie's hands trembled as she read the words over and over, her mind racing. Who would leave this? And how had they known what she was doing? She glanced around her property, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows, but the yard was empty save for Mr. Whiskers lounging on the railing. Forcing herself to stay calm, she took the note inside and called Sheriff Grayson. Though skeptical at first, Tom promised to send a deputy to dust for fingerprints and investigate further. Still, he warned her not to jump to conclusions. "These could be pranks," he said gruffly. "Kids messing around. Don't let it get to you." But Ellie knew better. This wasn't a prank, it was a warning, and it only strengthened her resolve to uncover the truth. That night, just as Ellie settled into bed with a book, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering, dread pooling in her stomach. "Hello?" she said cautiously. There was silence on the other end, followed by a low, distorted voice. "You're meddling in things you don't understand. Back off or you'll wish you had." The line went dead before she could respond. Ellie stared at the receiver, her pulse pounding in her ears. Whoever this was, they meant business, and they weren't afraid to escalate. Over the next few days, the calls continued. Each time, the message was the same: vague threats designed to intimidate her into stopping her investigation. Sometimes the caller hung up without saying anything. Other times, there was only heavy breathing. It was maddening, not knowing who was behind it or how far they'd go to silence her. Despite her growing fear, Ellie refused to give in. She installed a new lock on her front door, kept her cell phone close at all times, and made sure Mr. Whiskers stayed indoors where he'd be safe. But more than anything, she clung to the memory of Sarah Langley, the bright young woman whose life had been cut tragically short, and the knowledge that justice demanded answers. When Ellie confided in Maggie about the threats, the former reporter listened with a mixture of concern and stilly determination. "They're scared," Maggie said simply, folding her arms across her chest. "Whoever's behind this knows we're getting close. That's why they're trying to rattle you." "But what if they come after me? Or you?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound brave. "What if they hurt someone else?" Maggie placed a reassuring hand on Ellie's shoulder. "We can't let fear dictate our actions. If we stop now, Sarah's story will never be told. And whoever did this, they'll win." Her words struck a chord deep within Ellie. She thought about Sarah's family, still searching for closure after 2 decades. She thought about the people of Willow Creek, living under the shadow of secrets too painful to confront. Most of all, she thought about the kind of person she wanted to be, someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. "I won't back down," Ellie said firmly. "Not now." Maggie smiled faintly. "Then neither will I." Though the threats unnerved her, Ellie found strength in knowing she wasn't alone. Maggie became her steadfast partner, helping her strategize ways to protect themselves while continuing their investigation. Together, they decided to document everything: the notes, the calls, any suspicious activity, so they'd have evidence should things take a darker turn. Ellie also reached out to Sheriff Grayson again, pressing him to take the threats seriously. While Tom remained hesitant to allocate resources to what he saw as circumstantial evidence, he agreed to increase patrols around Ellie's property and keep an eye on Walter Hensley. As the days passed, Ellie's fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else: determination. Every note left on her porch, every chilling phone call, only fueled her resolve to see this through. She owed it to Sarah and to herself to face whatever came next head on. One evening, as she sat by the fireplace with Mr. Whiskers curled up beside her, Ellie allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and unanswered questions. But one thing was clear: she was no longer just a bystander in this mystery. She was a fighter, and she wouldn't rest until the truth saw the light of day. It was a chilly morning when Ellie decided to take a closer look at the area near her garden shed, where she'd noticed unfamiliar footprints days earlier. Armed with gloves and a small trowel, she began inspecting the soft earth around the structure, half expecting to find nothing more than animal tracks or loose debris. But then her trowel struck something solid beneath the surface. Kneeling down, Ellie brushed away the dirt to reveal the rusted corner of what appeared to be an old metal box. Her pulse quickened as she carefully unearthed it, its weight suggesting it had been buried for years. The lock was corroded, but after some effort, and a few well-placed taps with a hammer, she managed to pry the lid open. Inside, she found a trove of items that made her breath catch. Faded photographs, yellow documents, and handwritten notes bound together with brittle rubber bands. Each piece seemed frozen in time, relics from another era. As Ellie sifted through the contents, one thing became clear. Whoever had buried this box hadn't intended for it to be found. Among the photographs were grainy images of men in suits standing beside survey markers on open fields, fields that looked eerily familiar. Ellie recognized portions of Walter's property and other tracts of land surrounding Willow Creek. In some photos, the men were shaking hands, their expressions smug and self-assured. But it was the handwritten notes that truly sent chills down her spine. Dated between 2001 and 2003, the same period Sarah Langley disappeared. They detailed plans for illegal land acquisitions involving shell companies linked to Harmon Heights Group. Names jumped off the pages, each one tying prominent figures in town to the scheme. Paul Charles Hensley, Walter's father. Frank Callahan, the outspoken critic who vanished shortly after speaking out against the developers. Harold Meeks, a former mayor now deceased. There were also cryptic references to cleanup operations and mentions of payments delivered in cash. One note stood out in particular. SL knows too much. Deal with her discreetly. Ellie's stomach churned as she stared at those words. SL could only mean Sarah Langley. This wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was proof that someone had deliberately silenced her to protect their secrets. Ellie's mind raced as she pieced together the implications. Whoever had buried this box had likely been involved, or at least complicit, in the crimes it documented. Perhaps they'd hoped to erase all traces of their involvement by hiding the evidence here, far from prying eyes. But why choose her property? Had they assumed no one would ever dig in this spot? Her thoughts turned to Walter. If his father had played a central role in these dealings, it was possible he'd inherited not only the land, but also the guilt of covering them up. Was this why he'd acted so defensively when she mentioned Sarah? Had he known about, or even participated in, burying the box? Yet there was another possibility. Someone else might have planted the evidence on her property to implicate her, or to send a message. Either way, the discovery changed everything. Eager to share her findings, Ellie called Maggie and arranged to meet her at the library later that afternoon. When she arrived, clutching the metal box like a precious artifact, Maggie immediately sensed the gravity of what she carried. "What is it?" Maggie asked, pulling out a chair for Ellie to sit. Wordlessly, Ellie opened the box and spread its contents across the table. As Maggie examined the photographs and notes, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock and finally grim determination. "This is it," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling with urgency. "This is the smoking gun we've been looking for." She picked up one of the notes mentioning Sarah Langley and read it aloud, her tone sharp with indignation. "SL knows too much. That's not just a threat, it's an admission of guilt. Someone ordered her disappearance because she was getting too close to exposing them." Ellie nodded, her hands clenched tightly around the edge of the table. "And now we know who they are. Walter's family, Harold Meeks, Frank Callahan." She trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. "These aren't just names. They're people who destroyed lives to protect themselves." As they discussed their next steps, both women knew they were walking a dangerous line. The contents of the box implicated powerful individuals, people whose influence extended far beyond Willow Creek. Exposing them would come at a cost, and whoever had left the threats on Ellie's porch clearly meant business. "We need to get this information to Tom," Maggie said firmly. "He may not like it, but he can't ignore hard evidence like this." Ellie hesitated, glancing nervously toward the window. "What if they try to stop us before we can? What if they come after us?" Maggie placed a reassuring hand on Ellie's arm. "Then we'll make sure they don't succeed. We'll document everything, photograph the notes, scan the photos, and keep copies in multiple places, just in case. Ellie nodded, drawing strength from Maggie's resolve. They couldn't let fear dictate their actions, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. That evening, as Ellie sat alone in her kitchen, with the metal box resting on the table before her, she felt a surge of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, and an unshakable sense of purpose. The people responsible for Sarah's death had thought they could bury their crimes along with her, but they'd underestimated Ellie Harper. She thought about the young woman whose dreams had been stolen, whose voice had been silenced. And she thought about herself, a woman who had spent decades living quietly, content to fade into the background. No longer. With trembling hands, Ellie began cataloging the contents of the box, photographing each item meticulously. Every note, every image, was a thread unraveling a web of lies that had ensnared Willow Creek for decades. And as she worked, she vowed silently to see this through, to ensure that Sarah's story didn't end in darkness, but in justice. Whatever came next, Ellie was ready. The next morning, Ellie felt a surge of determination as she reviewed the contents of the metal box one final time. She knew what she had to do. Armed with undeniable evidence of Walter's family ties to the corruption surrounding Sarah Langley's disappearance, she resolved to confront him again, not out of anger, but to demand answers. She rehearsed her approach carefully, knowing that Walter would likely become defensive if cornered. Still, she couldn't ignore the possibility that he might reveal something crucial, something that could bring her closer to uncovering the full truth about Sarah's fate. As she walked across her property toward the fence line, separating her land from Walter's, Ellie kept a wary eye on the woods around her. The recent threats lingered in her mind, and she carried her phone tightly gripped in one hand, ready to call for help at the first sign of trouble. When Walter spotted Ellie approaching, his expression darkened immediately. He stood near the edge of his property, leaning against a weathered post, his arms crossed over his chest. His usual stoic demeanor seemed strained, almost brittle, as though he'd been expecting this moment. "What now?" he growled, his voice tinged with irritation. "Haven't you caused enough trouble poking around my business?" Ellie took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I found something, Walter," she began, holding up a photograph from the metal box. "Something I think you should see." Walter's eyes flicked to the image, then back to Ellie, his face pale beneath his scruffy beard. For a long moment he said nothing, his jaw working silently, as if struggling to form words. Finally, he sighed heavily and gestured for her to follow him into his yard. "All right, let's get this over with." They stopped near an old oak tree at the center of Walter's property, its gnarled branches casting long shadows across the ground. Ellie handed him the photograph, watching closely as he studied it. His hands trembled slightly before he handed it back. "I know what this is," he muttered, his voice low and resigned. "My father, he got greedy. Thought he could make a fortune selling off our land without asking questions. But I swear to God, Ellie, I didn't know anything about that girl, Sarah, until you brought her name up." Ellie narrowed her eyes, skeptical. "You expect me to believe you weren't involved? Your family profited from these deals, Walter. You must have known they were dirty." He shook his head vehemently. "I wasn't part of it. By the time I figured out what was going on, it was too late. My old man had already signed everything over. All I cared about was keeping quiet so we wouldn't lose the rest of the property. Or worse." His admission startled her. If Walter was telling the truth, it meant he'd spent years covering for his father's sins, but not necessarily committing any himself. Yet there was still something evasive in his tone, something unspoken. "Then why did you act so guilty when I asked you about Sarah?" Ellie pressed, her voice firm. "Why bury evidence on my property? What aren't you telling me?" Walter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a sound interrupted them, a faint rustling in the underbrush nearby. Both turned sharply toward the noise, their bodies tense. From the edge of the woods emerged a figure cloaked in shadow, partially obscured by the dense foliage. They wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over their face, making it impossible to discern their identity. In their gloved hand, They held what looked like a length of pipe or crowbar, glinting dully in the sunlight. "Who's there?" Walter barked, stepping protectively between Ellie and the intruder. "This is private property." The figure didn't respond, instead taking another deliberate step forward. Ellie's heart raced as she realized the situation was escalating dangerously. Whoever this was, they hadn't come to talk. "We need to go," Ellie whispered urgently, tugging at Walter's sleeve. "Now!" Without waiting for a response, she turned and bolted toward her side of the fence, clutching the photographs and notes tightly to her chest. Behind her, she heard Walter shouting, followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots moving quickly through the dry leaves. Ellie didn't stop running until she reached her front door, slamming it shut behind her and locking it with trembling hands. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. Outside, Mr. Whiskers yowled indignantly, startled by her sudden arrival. Only then did she allow herself to process what had just happened. Walter's confession had raised more questions than answers. Was he truly innocent or simply skilled at deflecting blame? And who was the shadowy figure lurking in the woods, someone sent to silence them both? One thing was certain, whoever they were, they weren't afraid to escalate. The threats had moved beyond anonymous notes and phone calls. Now Ellie's life was in real danger. But even as fear clawed at her resolve, she refused to back down. The evidence in her possession proved that Sarah Langley's death was no random tragedy. It was a calculated act meant to protect powerful men who thought themselves untouchable. And Ellie intended to ensure they faced justice, no matter the cost. For now, though, she needed to regroup and prepare for whatever came next. Back inside her cottage, Ellie spread the contents of the metal box across her kitchen table, her mind racing as she tried to reconstruct Sarah Langley's final movements. Maggie arrived shortly after, her face pale but determined as she joined Ellie in analyzing the evidence. "This changes everything," Maggie said, pointing to one of the notes referencing Sarah by her initials. "She didn't just disappear randomly. She was targeted because she knew too much." Ellie nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she sifted through the photographs and documents. "But why come here? Why Willow Creek?" Maggie leaned back, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Think about it. If Sarah uncovered proof of illegal land deals involving Harmon Heights Group, she would have realized how dangerous it was to stay in Milwaukee. This town might have seemed like a safe haven, remote, quiet, far from prying eyes. But who could she have trusted? Ellie asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Who would have helped her or betrayed her? Together they revisited the names mentioned in the notes, cross-referencing them with old news articles and town records. One name stood out repeatedly. Frank Callahan, the outspoken critic of the land deals, who had vanished shortly after speaking out at a town hall meeting. Frank was vocal about opposing the developers, Maggie mused, tapping her pen against the table. Maybe Sarah reached out to him for help. He could have been her ally, or her downfall. Ellie frowned, recalling what little she knew about Frank. He'd been a pillar of the community, well-liked and respected, until his sudden departure cast suspicion on his motives. Some whispered he'd fled to avoid trouble. Others believed he'd been silenced permanently. What if Frank wasn't running away? Ellie suggested quietly. What if he tried to protect Sarah and paid the price? The idea sent a chill down both women's spines. If Frank had harbored Sarah, only to be discovered by those protecting their secrets, it explained why neither of them had ever resurfaced. As they pieced together the timeline, a grim narrative began to emerge. Sarah, realizing she was in grave danger, likely fled Milwaukee with whatever evidence she'd gathered. Her destination? Willow Creek, where she hoped to find sanctuary with someone she trusted, perhaps Frank Callahan or another local sympathetic to her cause. Instead, she walked straight into a trap. The very people she sought refuge with may have turned against her, either out of fear or greed. Or worse, they might have unwittingly led her captors right to her doorstep. It makes sense, Maggie said grimly, flipping through faded newspaper clippings. If Sarah came here seeking safety, she wouldn't have expected betrayal, especially not from someone she thought was on her side. Ellie felt a pang of sorrow for the young woman whose life had ended so tragically. And once they got what they wanted, the evidence, they killed her to ensure she couldn't talk. The realization hit hard. Whoever buried Sarah's remains near Ellie's property hadn't done so out of carelessness. It was an act of calculated cruelty, meant to erase her existence entirely. They dumped her body in a remote location, hoping no one would ever connect the dots between her disappearance and the corruption tied to Harmon Heights Group. Despite the weight of their findings, Ellie and Maggie couldn't afford to dwell on the tragedy. Every piece of evidence brought them closer to exposing the truth and holding those responsible accountable. "We need to focus on proving this," Maggie said firmly, gathering the documents into neat piles. "We have the notes, the photos, and now a plausible theory about what happened to Sarah. That's enough to take to Tom." Ellie hesitated, glancing toward the window. The shadowy figure from earlier still lingered in her mind, a reminder that time was running out. Whoever was behind these crimes wouldn't hesitate to silence them permanently if given the chance. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her resolve. "But we can't go to Tom empty-handed. We need irrefutable proof, something concrete that ties all of this together." Maggie nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "Then let's get to work, because if we don't stop them now, they'll keep getting away with it." That night, as Ellie sat alone by the fire, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on the young woman whose memory had driven her this far. Sarah Langley had been brave, determined, and unyielding in her pursuit of justice, even when it cost her everything. Ellie clenched her fists, vowing silently to see this through. No matter how dangerous the path ahead, she wouldn't rest until Sarah's story was told, and until those who had stolen her life faced the consequences of their actions. For the first time in years, Ellie Harper felt truly alive, not because of what she stood to gain, but because of what she refused to lose. Armed with fragments of Sarah's story and their growing understanding of her final days, Ellie and Maggie set out to locate the place where Sarah might have sought refuge. After poring over old maps of Willow Creek and cross-referencing them with Frank Callahan's known haunts, they narrowed their search to an isolated area deep in the woods, a cluster of abandoned cabins that had once served as hunting lodges. The drive to the site was tense, the winding dirt roads flanked by dense trees, casting long shadows across the landscape. As they approached the first cabin, its weathered wooden walls sagging under decades of neglect, Ellie felt a mix of trepidation and hope. This could be the key to unlocking the rest of Sarah's story, or another dead end. Inside the cabin, dust motes floated lazily in the dim light filtering through cracked shutters. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but amidst the ruin, Ellie and Maggie found traces of life. A faded woolen blanket draped over a broken chair, a rusted camping stove tucked into a corner, and, most startling of all, a small leather-bound journal lying beneath a loose floorboard. Ellie picked it up carefully, brushing away years of accumulated grime. The cover bore no name, but when she opened it, the handwriting inside confirmed what she'd hoped. This was Sarah Langley's journal. As they pored over its pages, the young woman's voice came alive, vivid and urgent. Sarah described her desperate flight from Milwaukee, detailing how she had uncovered damning evidence against Harmon Heights Group and feared for her life. She wrote about reaching out to Frank Callahan, who initially offered her shelter, but grew increasingly nervous as pressure mounted from unknown sources. In one chilling entry, Sarah recounted overhearing a heated argument between Frank and someone else, someone threatening violence if she wasn't handed over. The next day, Frank disappeared, leaving Sarah alone and terrified. Her final entries were fragmented, filled with dread and resignation. "If you're reading this," she wrote, "it means I didn't make it. Please tell my family I tried to do the right thing." Tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she closed the journal. Maggie placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, her own expression somber. They had found the proof they needed, but at what cost? Just as they prepared to leave, gathering the journal and other remnants of Sarah's belongings, a sound froze them in their tracks, the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel outside. Ellie's heart sank as she exchanged a panicked glance with Maggie. "Stay behind me," Maggie whispered, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the ground. Before they could react further, the door creaked open, revealing the shadowy figure from earlier. This time, his face was fully visible and shockingly familiar. It was Daniel Hensley, Walter's younger brother, a man Ellie barely remembered seeing around town. His gaunt features and hollow eyes spoke of years spent living in obscurity. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled, stepping inside and blocking the doorway. In his hand, he held the same length of pipe they'd seen before, its dull metal glinting menacingly in the low light. Ellie instinctively backed away, clutching the journal tightly to her chest. "Daniel, why are you doing this?" he sneered, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Because people like you can't leave well enough alone. My father made mistakes, sure, but he did what he had to do to protect our family. And now you're digging up things that should stay buried." Maggie stepped forward cautiously, her voice calm but firm. "Your family profited from corruption, Daniel, from murder. You think covering it up makes you any better than them?" His jaw tightened, anger flashing across his face. "You don't understand. If word gets out, everything falls apart. Not just for us, but for everyone involved. Do you really want to destroy this town?" "We're not trying to destroy anything," Ellie interjected, her voice trembling but resolute. "We're trying to bring justice for Sarah, for Frank, for everyone who suffered because of your family's greed." For a moment, Daniel hesitated, his expression wavering between rage and guilt. Then with a snarl, he lunged toward them, raising the pipe high. Reacting quickly, Maggie swung the flashlight, catching Daniel off guard and sending him stumbling backward. The pipe clattered to the floor as he regained his footing, fury burning in his eyes. "Run!" Maggie shouted, pushing Ellie toward the door. They bolted into the woods, branches whipping at their faces as they fled blindly through the thick underbrush. Behind them, Daniel gave chase, his shouts echoing through the trees. Adrenaline coursed through Ellie's veins as she pushed herself harder, every step fueled by the knowledge that failure meant death, or worse, silence. When they finally reached the car, gasping for breath, Maggie fumbled with the keys while Ellie kept watch, her heart pounding wildly. Daniel emerged from the tree line moments later, his silhouette stark against the fading daylight. But instead of pursuing them further, he stopped, glaring daggers as they sped away. Back at Ellie's cottage, they sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily around them. Daniel's confession confirmed everything they'd suspected. The Hensleys had played a central role in Sarah's fate, protecting their secrets at any cost. "This isn't over," Ellie said finally, clutching the journal tightly. "Not until we expose them all." Maggie nodded grimly. "Then let's finish what we started, for Sarah." And with that, they began preparing their case, knowing full well that the battle ahead would be fraught with danger, but also certain that justice demanded nothing less. Ellie and Maggie's escape from the cabin had been harrowing, but they knew Daniel wouldn't give up easily. As they reached Ellie's property, panic set in when they spotted his truck parked haphazardly near the driveway. He was already here, waiting. "Stay in the car," Maggie urged, her voice tight with fear. But Ellie shook her head. "No, this ends tonight." Summoning every ounce of courage, she grabbed a heavy flashlight from the glove compartment and crept toward the house, Maggie close behind. The front door was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking ominously as they pushed it open. Inside, shadows danced across the walls, cast by the flickering light of a single lamp left on in the living room. Suddenly, Daniel lunged out from the hallway, his wild eyes locking onto Ellie. Before he could reach her, a streak of orange fur shot past, a blur of claws and teeth that landed squarely on Daniel's chest. It was Mr. Whiskers, hissing ferociously as he swiped at Daniel's face. Caught off guard, Daniel stumbled backward, cursing as he tried to fend off the furious feline. Seizing the moment, Ellie swung the flashlight with all her might, striking him squarely on the temple. With a groan, he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Maggie let out a shaky laugh, clutching her chest. "I think your cat just saved our lives." Ellie scooped up Mr. Whiskers, cradling him protectively as she caught her breath. "You're not wrong." Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Ellie had called Sheriff Grayson during their frantic drive home, and true to form, Tom arrived promptly with backup. When he saw Daniel sprawled on the floor, bound hastily with duct tape thanks to Maggie's quick thinking, his face went pale. "What in God's name happened here?" he demanded, staring at Ellie. She handed him the journal and summarized everything they'd uncovered, from Sarah's final days at the cabin to Daniel's confession about covering up his family's crimes. Tom listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted finally, rubbing his temples. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at decades of corruption and complicity from some powerful people." "It's true, Tom," Ellie said firmly, "and if you don't act now, more lives will be at risk." Tom nodded, his usual skepticism replaced by steely determination. "All right, let's get this bastard processed and start digging into the evidence. Whatever it takes, we'll make sure justice is served." With Daniel in custody, authorities moved swiftly to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. His confession, combined with the contents of Sarah's journal and the documents found in the metal box, painted a damning picture of greed, betrayal, and murder. Investigators traced the illegal land deals back to Harmon Heights Group, uncovering a network of shell companies and bribes that stretched across multiple states. Key figures, including several prominent developers, politicians, and even former Mayor Harold Meeks, were implicated in the scheme. Though many had long since retired or passed away, their legacies were forever tarnished. As for Walter Hensley, he initially denied involvement beyond inheriting his father's sins, but mounting pressure forced him to cooperate fully with investigators. In exchange for immunity, he provided detailed accounts of how Charles Hensley had orchestrated the sale of family land to Harmon Heights Group, knowingly participating in their corrupt practices. The case also shed light on Frank Callahan's disappearance. Evidence suggested he had indeed tried to help Sarah, only to be silenced permanently when those protecting Harmon Heights Group discovered his role. His remains were eventually found buried near an old industrial site outside Willow Creek, bringing closure to a mystery that had haunted the town for years. Months later, the story broke statewide, reigniting public interest in Sarah Langley's tragic fate. Her family, who had never stopped searching for answers, finally received the justice they had long sought. The exposure of Harmon Heights Group led to criminal charges against surviving executives and renewed calls for transparency in real estate development. For Ellie, the victory was bittersweet. She had uncovered the truth, but at great personal cost. Her quiet life in Willow Creek had been irrevocably changed, and though most townsfolk praised her bravery, whispers of resentment lingered among those implicated in the scandal. Still, she took solace in knowing that Sarah's voice had been heard. The young woman whose dreams had been stolen had become a symbol of resilience and justice, inspiring others to stand up against corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched. One evening, as Ellie sat on her porch with Mr. Whiskers curled up beside her, she gazed out at the fields stretching beyond her property. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. "Thank you," she murmured softly, raising her teacup in a silent toast to Sarah, "for trusting me to tell your story." And as the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of renewal, Ellie knew she had done the right thing. Weeks after the dust settled, Ellie found herself sitting at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea, staring at an empty spot where the human tooth had once lain. It was hard to believe that something so small, a fragment of bone no larger than a thumbnail, had set off a chain reaction, leading to the exposure of decades-old corruption and murder. As she traced the grain of the wooden tabletop with her fingertips, Ellie reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought Sarah Langley's story into her life. If Mr. Whiskers hadn't dragged that tooth home, if she hadn't followed her instincts to investigate further, the truth might have remained buried forever. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. "It's funny," she murmured aloud, glancing over at Mr. Whiskers, who lounged lazily in a patch of sunlight by the window. "If it weren't for you, none of this would have happened." Mr. Whiskers blinked slowly, unbothered by the weight of his accidental role in uncovering one of Willow Creek's darkest secrets. Despite the satisfaction of seeing justice served, Ellie couldn't shake the lingering unease that clung to her like a shadow. She often replayed the events in her mind, the anonymous threats, the confrontation with Daniel, the chilling realization that people she'd known for years had been complicit in such heinous acts. At night, she sometimes woke with a start, imagining footsteps outside her door or the creak of floorboards within her quiet cottage. Yet alongside the fear was a profound sense of purpose. For decades, she had lived quietly, content to fade into the background of her own life. But now she felt alive in ways she hadn't anticipated, driven not just by curiosity, but by a deep-seated need to make things right. Uncovering Sarah's story had awakened something inside her. A spark she hadn't realized still burned. She thought about Sarah often, not as a tragic figure defined solely by her death, but as a young woman full of promise and courage. Someone who had dared to stand up against powerful forces, even when it cost her everything. Knowing that Sarah's legacy would endure through the renewed attention on her case gave Ellie a measure of peace. One rainy afternoon, as raindrops tapped rhythmically against the windows, Ellie pulled out a fresh notebook and began jotting down thoughts. At first it was just fragments, memories of discovering the tooth, conversations with Maggie, the tense moments confronting Walter and Daniel. But soon those fragments coalesced into something more cohesive, the beginnings of a memoir. Writing became therapeutic, a way for Ellie to process everything she had experienced while also honoring Sarah's memory. She titled it Whiskers and Shadows, a nod to both her feline accomplice and the dark truths they had unearthed together. Each chapter chronicled a step in her journey, from the initial discovery to the harrowing showdown with Daniel, and offered reflections on what she had learned along the way. "I never imagined myself as a detective," she wrote in one passage, "but sometimes life hands us mysteries we can't ignore. And though the answers may be painful, the act of seeking them reminds us that justice matters, even when it comes too late." The process reignited a passion she hadn't felt in years. What started as a personal exercise soon evolved into something greater, a testament to resilience, curiosity, and the power of ordinary people to effect extraordinary change. When the manuscript was complete, Ellie hesitated before sharing it with anyone. Writing had been cathartic, but exposing her experiences to the world felt daunting. Still, she trusted Maggie enough to show her the draft. Maggie devoured it in a single sitting, tears streaming down her face as she reached the final pages. "Ellie, this is incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've captured not just what happened, but why it mattered. People need to read this." Encouraged by Maggie's enthusiasm, Ellie submitted the memoir to a publisher recommended by an old friend. To her surprise, it was accepted almost immediately, with editors praising its blend of suspense, heart, and social commentary. Within months, Whiskers and Shadows was published, earning critical acclaim and sparking renewed interest in cold cases tied to corporate corruption. Ellie embarked on a modest book tour, speaking at libraries and community centers across the region. Audiences were captivated by her tale, not just because of its intrigue, but because of the message it carried, that even the smallest actions can lead to profound outcomes. Back in Willow Creek, Ellie returned to her routines, though they felt different now. Gardening, crossword puzzles, and caring for Mr. Whiskers still brought her joy, but there was an added layer of fulfillment. She had faced danger, confronted evil, and emerged stronger for it. More importantly, she had ensured that Sarah Langley's story wouldn't be forgotten. On clear nights, Ellie would sit on her porch, gazing up at the stars and reflecting on how far she'd come. The experience had changed her. It had forced her to confront darkness, yes, but it had also illuminated parts of herself she hadn't known existed. She wasn't just Ellie Harper, the quiet widow living on the edge of town. She was someone who had fought for justice, who had refused to let fear silence her. And as she stroked Mr. Whiskers' soft fur, listening to the gentle hum of crickets in the distance, she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes all it takes is a tiny clue and a little courage to change the course of history.